Good morning, Justin. Happy Monday. How are you?
Howdy, doing all right. It's actually snowing here in West Virginia.
Are you serious? It's
Yeah,
snowing?
yeah. Spring doesn't start until June, apparently.
Well, today we're going to be talking about EV charging and the infrastructure associated with that and why it's so difficult. So I set for my background today. I thought all EV chargers were kind of in the desert, looking all sleek like this. You tell me right now in West Virginia it's snowing and your EV charging station doesn't look like this?
No, I mean, behind you, you really should just have a Walmart parking lot because that's actually where most of my charging stops have been in the Walmart parking lots. But sure, the desert's okay.
Interesting. I still can't believe it's snowing. I know it got chilly, but still, that's crazy. I'll be interested to hear. I don't know if you plan on driving in it, but I'll be interested to hear how it affects your battery. That I know is a big thing that comes up from time to time.
Yeah, for sure. I've already tested that out because it snowed just a week ago here. It snows a lot where I live. And yeah, it does cut range by about 20%, but that was expected. I knew that would happen, so it didn't really inconvenience me at all.
Fair. That's very fair. All right, Justin, we've got quite a few folks with us already. George is here with us. Christopher's here, learning fast. Got a question about the Ioniq 5. We'll come back to that. Jordan's here with us. Sean's here. John's here. Neil's here. Mark's here. Look at that, man. It's awesome that people are back for week number 2 of YAA Electric here on Plugged In. So, Justin, today we're going to kick the show off. We're going to talk about charging in the United States of America and when you think it might actually get easier. You've got a great article back on the Join YAA website that talks about how it's going to get easier. I'll pull that up here in just a second, but kick us off.
Yeah, so here in the United States, the recent bipartisan infrastructure bill allocated a whole $5 billion to EV charging infrastructure. Now, is that enough to make a big difference? Probably, but we got to keep in mind that we're looking at fast chargers here because honestly, there's not really a shortage of slower level 1 and level 2 chargers, which those are the types of chargers that might take you anywhere from 8 hours to 24 hours to top off your battery. We're looking at chargers that can top off an electric vehicle's battery in about 20 minutes. So that's what this money is going to be going towards, is DC fast charging around the United States. Now, it costs about $100,000 to install one. Let that sink in for a minute. $100,000 for one fast charger.
Wow.
So that's going to be one of the interesting things to see as EV adoption spreads. It looks like it's continuing to spread. And where exactly will this money go? Well, the U.S. federal government is going to, actually has already allocated money to the specific states, all 50 states. Each state gets a different amount based on how large they are and how many interstate highways they have. And then they're going to build or fund the building of these fast chargers along the interstate system. So we'll be looking at things like rest stops along the highway. They will soon be home to chargers. And then in any businesses that might want to have a public-private partnership can also be a part of this charging infrastructure build-out. But it doesn't end there. There's also public utilities, which are partnering together. The Edison Institute has coordinated the National EV Charging Network Initiative, which is looking to just build out public chargers with a combination of public funding, private funding, and a whole bunch of different utility-owned initiatives, basically coming together, pooling their money, and then expanding access to charging, especially in rural areas. So that specific initiative looks like it'll have a greater impact in rural America, which is where I live. And I know that if EVs are really going to be 50% of sales in 2030, like some say, rural America is going to have to be not be forgotten. There has to be chargers and, so-called, I guess it's derogatory, but so-called flyover country. You got to have chargers everywhere. You can't just forget about the majority of America's land.
So help me out here. Where are we today in terms of coverage and amount of charging infrastructure? Where do we need to get to? And then what's like the very, very, very future state? Like, is the future state every gas station is also now a charging station as well?
This is so interesting. I'm glad you brought up gas stations. So I'll start with where we are now. Out of the 63,000 public charging stations that exist today in the United States, 17,000 are fast chargers. That sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but the vast majority, like over 70%, are in California, New York, and a few other states along the coasts. If you're driving on Interstate 20, Interstate 30 down through the Deep South or I-70 across the Midwest, chargers are going to be once every 75 miles if you're lucky. So there is not an even distribution of these chargers. So what about gas stations? Gas stations are everywhere. You would think that this would be a great opportunity for them to become so-called future-proof or to capitalize on a new business venture, right? Install a charger.
Yeah.
It's the cost of these chargers that's so prohibitive. There have been so many gas station CEOs and different marketing leaders and business planners saying, look, we can't make money on these chargers unless someone helps us pay for them. So that's where the federal funding and state funding and utility funding comes into play. I saw that one owner of gas stations in Georgia, he owned 4 gas stations. He said that if the federal government had not paid for 90% of the cost of these charger installations at his 4 gas stations, he would have spent about $500,000 on it.
Wow.
You can't recover that cost easily. You can't buy enough. Let's see. What do people buy at gas stations, Zach? Do they buy like Twizzlers and stuff? Or
Well, wait. Let's do this. I mean, we're real people. What do you buy at the gas station? I'll tell you what I buy usually.
I buy Monster Energy drinks. Don't tell anybody though. Don't tell anybody.
See, I'm a big like black coffee and one of those really crappy cookies. Like you'll just see me just cruising down the highway in either my dad or girlfriend's car with a crappy cookie and crappy coffee. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Do we need, Justin? Do we need the gas station owners to be doing that though? Like, are we ever going to reach, like you just said before, that you can drive across the entire country in an electric vehicle? Do we need them to be funded to be able to do something like this?
Well, that's arguable. Now, here's something interesting. Georgia's state lobbying group for gas stations has came together and has actually asked the Georgia Power Utility Commission to ensure that if Georgia Power, the state utility cooperative, gets deeper into the EV charging business, that they will guarantee that they will not charge less than the wholesale rate that I'm sorry, not the wholesale rate, the rate that customers have to pay. Basically, they want to make sure that Georgia Power isn't trying to offer too good of a deal to its customers if they install EV charging. They want to make sure that it remains competitive so that gas stations, if they decide to get further into EV charging, people are still using their chargers, because why would you go to the gas station if you can get EV charging for half the price down the street at some Georgia Power station?
This is so interesting. This is so interesting because most utility companies, I'm going to say most, I imagine it's all, but I don't know if it's all, most state utility companies are owned by state cooperatives, or at least have like a heavy influence by the state. Those utility companies could care less who's consuming their electricity. They just want to sell more of it. This is all coming back to me because I remember, I forget who I was having the conversation with, but it was someone who was associated with the state of Florida, their power coalition, and they were starting to do direct mailers to residents saying, here's the best time to be charging your EV if you're interested, like EV buying guides and EV charging guides. What incentive does the state-owned or state-operated power coalition have to work with gas? They don't care. They just want people to consume it. You've got a really interesting dynamic that's about to play out, and it's going to be different in every single state. That is mind-boggling to think about.
Yeah, and Zach, as you know, my background is also in solar energy, so I come at it from this different perspective of like, wow, so the whole nationwide and worldwide, honestly, utility grids are going through this transformation of more and more solar power. Of course, there's also wind energy and other alternative sources of intermittent power.
Yeah.
And then battery storage. You've got all that transformative development going on, but you also have the possibility of dramatically increased demand during off-peak hours for electric vehicle charging. So usually, traditionally, peak hours on the utility grid, that's going to be like 5 p.m. when everyone gets home off of work, they're all cooking dinner, stuff like that. The grid is under the most stress. Well, what if everyone's driving an electric vehicle? You're going to be looking at peak demand shifting to like midnight, when people like me, this is what I do every night with my Ioniq 5, they're plugged in, juicing up their vehicle in the middle of the night, pulling 1 kilowatt hour consistently throughout the whole night. That's going to be like a whole paradigm shift for the utility industry. And how is our infrastructure going to deal with that? Those of you viewers and listeners out there who've brought up those questions, like, what about the utility grid? I've had some viewers messaging me about that. That's a valid concern. And anyone who tells you it's not is kind of lying to you. So we'll definitely be digging into that further on YAA Electric.
I mean, because think about it. Electricity, it's in power consumption, it's supply demand, just like any other market. The tricky thing with electricity is how the hell do you store it, right? It's on the grid, and you either increase the amount that's being transmitted on the grid or decrease the amount. It's not like you can just hold it while it's like, on that antenna line. No, it's electricity. It's constantly moving. This is an incredibly complex and challenging engineering and kind of like, man, what's the word, Justin? What's the word? It's a class that you could take in high school, and it's like how people interact with one another. What's that word I'm looking for?
I don't know, but I will divert and redirect, because if this show was about battery grid storage, which it's not,
Yeah.
there would be so much to say about how EV charging stations, some of them Tesla stations, are even starting to be installed with battery storage next to the station. That has already happened, Zach. So we're seeing some charging infrastructure players in this game already planning ahead and installing massive battery packs next to their chargers, so that once, or if the grid ever has some kind of instability because of who knows what in the future, that charging station will still be good to go because it's got massive battery packs ready to charge up the cars. And one more thing I want to mention, there's also transformers. So we were talking about gas stations. Why can't a gas station just spend $100,000, install some fast electric car chargers? Well, they also have to make sure that they have the electrical infrastructure in place to supply high voltage power. Like that alone can cost $100,000 on top of the other costs. So not every gas station could just say, hey, sign me up, I want a fast charger. You have to talk to the grid operators. You have to get the electrical company involved and make sure that you're not going to overload the grid, or even worse.
This is like, my gears are just spinning. Like, the answer to this question, when will charging, be for the masses in the United
It's
States?
a rabbit hole.
There's no answer. There's absolutely no
Yeah.
answer. It entirely depends on what direction the industry goes. Like we've talked about in prior shows, maybe we end up in a future state where there's smaller batteries on EVs, but they charge fast. Like there's so many different pieces that could influence the direction that we need to go from an infrastructure standpoint. That being said, I think the power companies are going to win here. Like no matter what, they're going to be happy.
Yeah, and I want to try to provide some crystal ball answers. Crystal ball.
Yeah.
Because in our first 3 shows, I was like, we asked a lot of questions, and I think I didn't always try to provide an answer. Well, I'm going to get better at that. So when will charging an EV get better in America? It's looking like 2025 to 2030. I know that's a while away, but 2025 charging an EV is going to be a lot easier. Why? Because the national EV grid, the EV charging grid that is currently getting funding allocated and currently figuring out where are things going to go and who gets what, that will be built out between 2023 and 2025. So right now in West Virginia, where I live, if I drive north on Interstate 77, there's not a lot of charging. But by 2023, I've already seen the plans and the legislative documents showing how they intend to use the funding that they've just received. They're going to install some fast chargers, and that makes me excited. So 2023 to 2025, Americans should not have to worry much about finding a charger along interstate highways. Now, will rural America have access to charging by then? I sure hope so, but that's probably going to be after 2023, more like 2025 to 2028. Now, why is that the case? Because this first round of funding, this $5 billion, is mostly going towards interstate travel. Now, if you live in a rural area where an interstate crisscrosses through your area, well, then great, you'll probably have some chargers. But there's going to have to be other sources of funding if rural America is going to get caught up to this whole charging curve.
Something tells me that with all the money that's currently invested in the EV push, eventually that money will make it to be allocated. Let's switch gears, Justin. I want to talk a little bit about an article that showed up on The Drive very recently. Let me pull it up on the screen, and hopefully you can give us some of your expertise here. This article is posted by Kevin Williams just yesterday. MPGE explained how EV efficiency is calculated and why it doesn't always add up. MPGE is confusing, but we're here to demystify a complicated metric. And so the author here, Kevin Williams, goes through and he explains what MPGE is, what's wrong with it, are the manufacturers lying, why it matters, etc. Justin, I know you took the time to read through this. Can you help explain to me and our audience what the heck is MPGE, and what am I supposed to get from it when I'm contemplating or looking at buying an electric vehicle?
Now, the reason I have a bone to pick with the author of this article is because I think MPGE, which is miles per gallon equivalent, is what makes this whole like efficiency thing approachable to people who are used to just driving gasoline or diesel powered vehicles. It makes understanding EV efficiency approachable. Why is that? Because you're getting down to the very basics of physics and chemistry here. How many miles can you drive for a given unit of energy? So 1 gallon of gasoline contains the same amount of raw energy, like joules of energy in physics class, as 33.7 kilowatt hours of electricity. Now, what does that mean? Well, then you start to look at the battery capacity of an EV. Like my Hyundai Ioniq 5, it has a 72.5 kilowatt hour usable battery pack. Now, if you factor in the whole battery pack, it's like 78 kilowatt hours. Why is there a difference? Because you have a buffer. It's a part of having a healthy battery is to have a buffer. So, how many miles can I go on a 72.5 kilowatt hour battery? I can go about 256 miles. That's the EPA certified range of my car. Well, then you start to do the math, and it comes out to about 90 something miles per gallon equivalent. So why am I a fan of MPGE? Because it makes EV efficiency approachable for those who don't read all the EV blogs like I do. They might have stumbled into a dealership or been looking into EVs online for the very first time, and they don't know a thing about them. Well, this is a good start to understand one of the greatest benefits of electric cars, which is efficiency.
Where do you think the confusion comes in, Justin? Is it simply like, I don't know, like, yeah, where's the confusion come in?
The fact that EVs don't use gasoline, so why would you say miles per gallon? Like there's no gallons of anything in the car, right? Um, I think also the confusion comes into just maybe the author and a lot of others out there being hesitant to hold on too much to what they think will be a bygone era of combustion fueled vehicles, when in reality, it's going to be around for at least another 20, 30 years, maybe even longer. Combustion vehicles aren't going away, even if EV sales dramatically increase, right? Unless, of course, some kind of legislation shuts that down, but that's a whole nother topic. So, no, how do you actually measure efficiency with an electric vehicle if you're an EV nerd or an automaker? How do you measure that correctly? There's not even a set answer, because in the United States, it's mostly miles per kilowatt hour. In some other countries, it's 100 kilometers per kilowatt hour or kilometers per kilowatt hour. So there's various standards of EV efficiency around the world. But here in the US, it's miles per kilowatt hour.
So I like this comment from Learning Fast. The best way to measure efficiency for any vehicle is dollars per mile. And one of the things that I think a lot about, Justin, with YAA is helping people better understand what's the cost of ownership going to be. And when you start to think about the cost of ownership, it's the depreciation, your insurance, maintenance, repairs, and fuel. Like maybe I'm missing one other thing, and fuel can obviously be gas or it can be electricity. And I feel like Learning Fast hit the nail on the head. Like the true measure is going to be how much does it cost me to drive a mile, not how many miles can I drive per gallon in my car that doesn't take. Like I hopefully eventually someday we get there. But I'm curious, do you agree with me? Is that kind of like the measurement that we should ultimately get to?
Yes, and I also think it's the most compelling measurement for those who are considering an EV. Now, here's why. Data and multiple studies and just common sense show that the more you drive, the greater your savings will be if you buy an EV. So if I drive 5,000 miles a year, I'm hardly driving. It would not make good sense to buy an EV if financial reasons are your driving factor, right? If you drive 10,000, 15,000, or even 20,000 miles or more per year, switching to an EV can save you lots of money. And this is something that I'll be keeping track of with my own recent purchase. So I'll let you know how it goes.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm again, gears are spinning, but I can see a world where, like, on our car search, it tells you what the cost per mile is. I think that would be super helpful for people to be able to. It would be helpful for me because even as we're having the conversation about MPGE, and I read the article on the drive, I'm just like, yeah, this is confusing a little bit. Like, I don't want it to be, but it kind of is, which is unfortunate because you're right. It's a potentially more approachable way for people to understand what they're getting into.
Yeah, and I want to wrap that segment up by saying that, like, what would we replace it with? What would we replace MPGE with? It would be miles per kilowatt hour. And we could do that, and I believe it already says that on the Monroney stickers for EVs at the lot. However, the average person looking at an EV may not understand that 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour is an okay efficiency. or that 4.5 miles per kilowatt hour is a great efficiency.
Yeah.
So I don't think it should be either or, it should be both.
And yes, Jordan did explain it in the chat, so please read through the chat. We see you, Jordan. Thank you for that. All right, I wanted to bring up one other topic, and then I want to go to a few questions that we've received. Justin, Ford raising prices, but this has pretty much become the status quo in the auto market, and then also just like EVs in particular. The Mach-E prices have increased significantly. Do you want to give us the rundown on what's going on here?
Yeah, so in the United Kingdom, Ford has upped the prices of the Mach-E by about 14%. Now, what's weird about this is it's not with a new model year. It's just like overnight, hey, prices are going up. This is basically the Tesla model. Ford has been known to be following the Tesla model increasingly over time, and honestly, it's brought them some success. I'm sure Justice over here on the team would agree with that, right?
I mean, people are buying Teslas left and right.
But Ford sells every Mustang Mach-E that they can make. We've seen that with a lot of automakers. Demand is not the problem, and that has given them some desire to kind of budge the prices and see what people are willing to pay. I mean, Tesla's prices are up over 20% year over year, and they're still sold out for like 8 months. So Ford is starting to play around with that model, but they do cite different supply shortages for bumping up that price, and it's so far just limited to the United Kingdom, but what'll happen here in the United States, we'll see. The Mustang Mach-E has been one of the best-selling EVs here in the U.S., and as I've been going to Electrify America stations myself, I see quite a few of them.
All right, so you said it a moment ago. You want to do a better job of putting your crystal ball out there. I think this is like T-ball. I think we're teeing it up for you to hit a home run. What do you think is going to happen to Mach-E prices in the United States, Justin?
I think there will be a smaller increase, but
Okay.
there will be an increase here in the U.S. I bet there will be about a 10% increase here in the U.S.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if there isn't. Let's go to a few questions that we've seen come in, Justin. One was posted on the community forum. I'll pull it up on the screen. It came from Ralph. And I know we've got a few things we want to talk about here. Ralph said, "Hi, I watched the first 3 YAA Electric shows on YouTube. I think this is a great show." Thank you for that, Ralph. I enjoyed the discussion regarding EVs, though I own a 2021 Hyundai Elantra SEL, which is an internal combustion engine vehicle. Back in 2014, I test drove a Leaf, and I already had a different car at the time. The one question I'd like to ask is, in Justin's research, did he come to any conclusions as to what degree EVs are better for the environment / more eco-friendly than combustion gas-powered vehicles? There seems to be mixed conclusions about this I have read and viewed. And I'll take a moment here. Electric Vehicles channel on the YAA community forum. Lots of posts. Please post your questions here, and we'll, of course, be bringing them up on the show, as well as what comes through in the chat. But let's talk a little bit about this, Justin, and kind of the sustainability angle of EVs.
Yeah, Ralph, I'm so glad you brought up this question because it doesn't get talked about enough. Too many people just assume that no matter what, buying an EV is going to be like some kind of perfect solution to all the sustainability problems of the world. There's nuance, just like many things in life, there's nuance that does not get talked about enough. Now, here's the basics of it. The more you drive, the greater the positive environmental impact will be from switching from combustion to an EV. Also, the longer the cycle of ownership is, the greater the benefit will be of switching to an EV when sustainability is what we're talking about. Now, another level of nuance is, where do you live? Because EVs obviously use electricity. Where does that electricity come from? Well, unless you've got a roof covered in solar panels like some of my neighbors do, which is awesome, then you're going to be relying on the grid for the power that goes into your vehicle. The energy mix of your local grid determines basically how much carbon emissions are produced from the electricity that your car consumes to drive however far you drive. Now, what we found is that even in the dirtiest electricity grids, the grids that rely the most on coal, it's still much, much cleaner than driving even a hybrid vehicle. And there's an interesting map, Zach. I don't know if you have it available, but there's a great map which has been very heavily researched by the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is an international group of scientists who are always studying ways of making basically our society more sustainable. This map is like basically divided out by utility grids. So in the Midwest, you have a few grids that are very heavily reliant on coal for their power grid. there, that is where like there's the most negligible benefit. So a car that gets just 41 miles per gallon, that might be like a Honda Insight hybrid. That would be about as environmentally friendly as driving an EV. Because if you're driving an EV, most of that power is just coming from coal. But look at California, where most of their power comes from hydropower, solar, and wind. You would have to have a combustion vehicle that gets 134 miles per gallon in order to be having the same emissions as an electric vehicle. So that's kind of amazing. It shows, and this changes all the time because the grid mix up is always changing all the time. Where do you get this energy? It's always in flux.
This is awesome to look at, like New York State up here. You'd have to have a 255 mile per gallon equivalent internal combustion engine vehicle. The Arizona grid, 67. It's really cool.
Yeah, and I also mentioned the cycle of ownership. How long do you own the vehicle? Why is that so important? Because there's obviously a huge environmental impact to building any vehicle, whether it's an EV or combustion vehicle. Raw materials are involved, and with EVs, it's lithium mining. For those of you out there, I did not forget about the impact of lithium mining. And I know a lot of people think that that's something that's just overlooked. There's also cobalt mining, which luckily a lot of EV technologies are stepping away from because of sustainability and human labor type issues. All of that stuff becomes less and less of an impact on the greater scale of sustainability through longer ownership cycles. So if I own my Ioniq 5 for 10 years and it doesn't somehow end up in a landfill, then the environmental impact of that mining that was used to create the battery is going to be negated over a longer ownership cycle.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. We've got a great question here from Learning Fast. What does upstate New York use for power? I don't know.
Hydropower.
Hydro, yeah, that kind of makes sense. They've got all the lakes up there that flow down. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, Justin, there was an article that came out last week, and we're going to wrap the show with this. A charging company named Volta, they did a study to see what needs to happen for more EV adoption. And one of the findings was that 75% of people considering buying an EV ranked convenient access to EV charging as their top barrier to making a switch. Now, obviously, that ties back with what we've been talking about here before. And also, there was some Tesla news about some cable. I mean, are we actually in an environment where you think this Volta study, the idea that 3 out of 4 EV considerers are being held back by not having access to charging, or do you think that's a bit of a crutch? Like, what's your take on that?
So what I personally think is that a lot of America does not know just how expensive EVs are, because I was kind of surprised that that percentage was higher than those who quoted that cost was prohibitive.
Yeah,
That's amazing because let's see how much of America lives in shared housing, or what's the term for it? Like apartments.
I'm not sure what the number is, but I also don't know what the term is, but I'm certain it's a lot.
Yeah, I think it's like about 20%.
Wow.
Yeah, I just looked it up. It says 17% of Americans live in apartments. That is definitely an issue for EV adoption, because are apartment owners willing to install EV chargers and make that more accessible to everyone? I don't know. That's to be determined. But is it a bigger factor than cost when you're looking at the cheapest Tesla now costing about $50,000, like for just a base, no strings attached, nothing fancy Tesla? I don't know. I think cost is personally going to be the prohibitive factor.
Yeah, and then like what was the sticker price for the Ioniq 5?
Yeah, so I opted for the highest trim because I wanted a car that I would want to keep and not trade in for a long time, and it was 56,000 sticker price. I paid at MSRP, but the Ioniq 5 does start at about 44,000 for the lower trims.
But still, it is nuts to think that people are more concerned about, hey, I want to make sure I can fill it up, which you've begun to expose us to. Not that complicated. You can trickle charge it at home, and it's actually not that big of a deal. You live in rural West Virginia, and you're still, finding fast chargers. You're a-okay. The fact that it's going to cost you $50,000 to get into an EV, you'd think that would be the bigger factor. But at the same time, the average new car price right now is over $50,000. You're right about $50,000. People buying trucks, the average new truck price is like 52 or 53. Inflation.
Yeah, we can just keep blaming it on inflation forever.
I think we will for the foreseeable future. Well, Justin, happy Monday to you. thank you again for making it back for week 2. I think we've got the rest of week 2 in front of us, and then week 3, week 4. I think we got a lot that we're going to cover over the coming months and years. So appreciate your time today, and as always, leave us your comments. Go back to the community forum. Let us know what you want to hear about, and we'll be sure to cover it.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And make sure to follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and don't forget to join the YAA community.
Yes, join YAA.com/community. All right, Justin, happy Monday to you.
Happy Monday.